Welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on the people in your workplace.
Hello and welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on the people in your workplace. I'm your host, JP, and I help businesses get the most out of their technology through the engagement and the support of their people. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of strategic workforce planning at all levels within your organization. If you're not already doing so, strategic workforce planning can sometimes seem like another budget black hole. It's something you just don't have time for. And the truth of the matter is, if you don't start doing it, the risks are far greater and often far more expensive than doing it right. In this episode, I'm joined by Dave Burrows from Strictly Workforce Planning, and we're going to discuss how you can start taking a more forward-thinking, strategic lens to your workforce planning and understand what are the different levels of tech that you can use to get the best outcomes. Dave has over 30 years' experience developing systems and teams devoted to the delivery of data, reporting, and analytics, including 17 years focused on delivering people analytics and strategic workforce planning, both here in Sydney and in London. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Hi, JP. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Really good, thank you. Now, I wanted to start off, we try to make sure and not assume too much prior knowledge here on the pod. So can you start off giving us a little bit of background on what strategic workforce planning is and why it's crucial for businesses, especially today in the sort of topsy-turvy environment that we're in?
Sure thing. Thanks. Well, fundamentally, strategic workforce planning is aligning the people strategy to an organization's business strategy. So looking at what they would like to achieve, how they want to grow a business. So most businesses know which direction they're heading. And so this is really a chance to plan scenarios in advance so that you have the workforce you need at the right time and when you need it. And that means looking at all the different aspects of what you want to achieve. So if you're expanding into a new area, into a new market, if you're building a new facility to double your output, it's making sure that you've thought about the people that you're going to need to work in those environments. Most businesses plan other areas of asset management, so they'll invest in buildings and infrastructure and other equipment that they might need to deliver their business. But obviously people is another asset that they need to consider when they're planning their strategy. So that's really what it is. It's making sure that you consider the options in front of you before you embark on that journey.
And thinking of, I guess, planning ahead and knowing what the path is, it's a little bit like shaking a magic 8-ball and trying to figure out what's the future hold and understanding that. But obviously, I mentioned in the intro the risks of not having some planning, not having a bit of foresight as to what can happen within the organisation. There's obviously expenses and negative outputs for that. What are some of the risks that you think happen if you don't have a good plan in place for your people?
There's a big topic at the moment that everyone's talking about productivity, and I think one of the key issues is if you're carrying a lot of vacancies in your organisation, so you haven't really thought about who you're going to need to do the work. And then you are competing at the moment with a lot of different organizations that possibly you weren't in competition with before for the talent you need. So, for example, you may wish to expand and start using digitization, digitize your organization, start using more and more technical tools that are out there. You're going to need the workforce that can not only deliver those technical advancements, but also manage them for you and run them. And you'll find yourself overnight more almost competing with organizations outside your market, organizations looking for those skills as well. So often, if you haven't thought about that in advance, you might find that you can't actually get those skills when you need them. So the idea is that you plan in advance so that you can actually figure out, if you are going to have a gap, what you're going to do about it. Because sometimes, even if you can't recruit the people into your organization, you can think about who else you have who has a good level of skill in a certain area that you can train and build and grow into those roles. And I often say to people, it's much easier for you to change a plan than to start planning from scratch. So once you have a plan in place, you can then think about how you're going to adapt that plan. So I think the risks really are around carrying too many vacancies in your organization, but also not being able to grow in the way you wish because you haven't got the people to drive the business you need.
And is it traditionally limited to the recruitment and sort of the position management side of things, or would you within a framework start looking at things like, you know, cultural impacts of change within the industry, or external and internal factors? Do you take all of those things into account, or is it just focused on like sort of people structures?
It's an interesting one, JP, because I think what happens is once you start working through your organization, looking at the opportunities that you want to take for your people, that you initially start on the resource management. So you're looking at who you need, you're looking at your organizational structure, you're looking at where you're going to need new skills and new talent. And then you start to figure out that, often is the case, you will have a surplus of people in other areas of your business. So if you take a tech implementation, for example, you might find that the tech delivers some real opportunities to do things more efficiently. So you will need fewer people in a particular area of your business. However, those people could be transferred or transitioned into new roles. And so you can build their skill sets and their knowledge by training and teaching, and over a period of time, because you're planning for this over a period of 2 to 3 years, say, evolve them into their new roles. And that's an interesting one, because not only do you retain the legacy knowledge that they have of your organization, but you're also developing career pathways for people. And that is very, very good for culture, and a thing called, we all know and love in HR, called the EVP, or the employee value proposition. In other words, what employees feel and why they want to work for you other than money, because they can see that they have a career path, because they can see that there is opportunity in the organization. You're not just going to make them redundant because their role is no longer there. You're actually looking to redevelop and help them into new career pathways. And I think it does touch on all aspects, really, but it really does start with the resource management, making sure, let's be honest, it's making sure the business has got what they need. And I think that as HR practitioners, that's our key driver in workforce planning. But then it moves into a beautiful offshoot of that is the culture that it drives, and benefits that you gain from it. And then, of course, it then comes full circle, because if you've got an organization that has a strong employee value proposition, happy employees, good culture, makes it a lot easier to recruit into, because you can actually attract the right people and the people that you want.
So we're looking at our business today. We're listening to the podcast, thinking, I don't have anything in place. We've not really looked, gone down the road. What are the first steps that a business can take to start to incorporate a bit of workforce planning into their model? Like sort of day zero, never touched it before, never really thought about it. Where do I start?
I would say start small, find a problem, find something that is a real pain point for someone in the business. So it could be that you want to expand into an organization, or you want to put in some tech, and find out what is the problem. So it could be, we know we're going to need some data science capability, or we know we're going to need more data analysts, or it could be we need some technical skill sets to enable us to launch in a certain business area. Find out what that problem is, and then really start small, really get underneath it, and understand, firstly, who have you got working in your organization that might be have good skills in that space. What are the skills you're going to need? And then try and solve for that first. And I think once you can build out a process based upon that, you can then start to scale more, or scale further across your organization. But I always think the really successful workforce planning programs start very small at the beginning, and really test their processes, test their thinking, understand the data they have, because for me, this is all about data, and I think you need to understand what data
Mm.
you currently have, so that you can actually make the most of it. And then once you've got that first initial project off the ground, and you've solved a problem for someone, and you've got a plan in place, you can then build that process and repeat. So you can take it to another area of the business. And once you start that process, it's kind of snowballs. And all of a sudden, you find yourself being one of the most popular people in the organization, because everybody can see how the planning works. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where people don't really see the benefit or understand it well until they actually see it happening. And so it's easier to just get started very small first.
You mentioned that it's about data. Where can I come to the party with, like, thinking about the sort of data that I should be collecting? What are the sort of top 5 data points that I need to be thinking about now, if I am just starting out?
I think most organizations think they need to have all kinds of information and everything. They need to know everything before they start. And I actually think that you've probably got the most of the data that you need already, either in your systems or in your workforce already. So you obviously need to know who works for you. So you need to know their their longevity, how long they've been working for you. In some cases, you might need to know their age, because if you've got a specific skill set that's only known about or only being done by a workforce that may wish to retire in the next 5 years, you may need to think about how that could be addressed, for example. So I think there are various data points that you already have. If you're paying people, and you usually are in an organization, you know who they are, where they live or where they reside, how they work, so whether they work remotely, whether they work out of an office, what are their skills. Now, that can be a bit of a gap for some people, and I think that we talk about supply and demand in workforce planning, and really the supply really means who works for you and what are their skills. And so if you've already started to understand those skills, you can get that through the line management, through the people who know those workers best, so they're leaders, line leaders. But you can now start to bolster that with other sources. There are other great sources that can get you started. As you probably know, I used to work for Fathom, which was acquired by Pearson, and there are other organizations like Beamery and Lightcast and Drought in the US. Those guys all have very good information around specific roles. So if you're talking about a data analyst, they'll know the core skills for a medium grade business analyst or data analyst. They'll know what skills they currently have. And then you can then actually add to that by beginning to understand what extra skills your people have. And it's nearly always around legacy knowledge. So if you're a machinery manufacturer, you'll have somebody who really understands your product better than anyone else. So that's really, really useful and really helpful. And I think things like tenure, how long they've been in that role, all of those good things are the basic information that you would need, because what you're then going to do is say, okay, they're the roles we currently have. What are the roles we want to bring into our organization? And that comes down to understanding what it is you want to do. So, for instance, if you're going to expand into a new market, you're going to need sales folk, you're going to need business development skills. So you look at those skills and say, okay, what does that look like? Well, we've got 4 or 5 people who already do that kind of thing. Let's now get more of those, or get more of this type of skill, and you can start to figure that out. But it starts with understanding your existing workforce.
I think it's also worth mentioning that when I say data and when you say data, we are talking about the same thing. We're just coming at it from different reading of the word. The number of times I've spoken about data/data and used both versions of the word in the one presentation, I couldn't count on my hands. I keep doing it all the time. I get in my head about it sometimes.
We're coming at it from different hemispheres.
So I wanted to talk about exactly. I've spent too long all over the world. I guess that's why it's a first world problem to have. Thinking about now, I guess common mistakes or pitfalls that I want to avoid when doing it. Obviously, you mentioned that it's aligning that the workforce strategy and how we're going to deal with the structure of people within the organization, and aligning that to the corporate objectives and the organization's pathway as to where they're going to head. What are some of the things that I need to make sure or be mindful of to not to not fall into traps?
Yeah, as I just said about the data, everybody thinks they need everything to start, and they don't. They can start with what they have and then look at what else they might need. So I think that's a real pitfall that often people hesitate to start because they don't think they know enough. I think there is a resistance to change. So, we've always managed to do this. We've always managed to hire as many people as we want. Why should we want to change? Well, we're seeing more and more vacancies in more and more organisations. We're running at, almost 100% employment here in Australia, for example. It's not always going to be possible just to hire as many people as you want. So I think you need to actually think about how you want to change the way you do things, and that resistance to change can really hinder a good workforce planning program. And look, we talked about this last week, JP. There's always something more important, right? There's the classic upstream analogy where you're constantly pulling people out of the river, trying to solve those immediate problems rather than actually stop whatever's causing them to be in the river in the first place. So it's actually trying to think ahead. Now, everyone says, oh, yeah, but we don't have time to think of that long-term planning because we're too busy doing all these other things. But what I say is try running them in tandem, try running them in parallel, rather, so that you can actually start to think about the future, but still deliver on your day-to-day stuff, but just carve out a little bit of time just to start thinking around how things could change, how things you might need to plan differently. So I think those are the real three things for me. I think often people think that they don't have the technology to do this work, but you really don't need too much tech. It can be done quite simply.
Yeah, I do want to ask about the role that tech plays, but before I do, just something I thought of really quickly is how far into the future do you recommend I plan for? Am I looking, and sort of what dictates that? Am I looking 6 months down the track, 3 years down the track? How far forward should I start planning?
And it really depends on your business. So if you're a startup, so when I was at Fathom as a startup, 6 months was strategic. We were looking that 6 months ahead. What are we going to be doing? Because you are small, you've got to work very agilely. You've got to really think on your feet most of the time. You can't plan any further than 6 months. I did some work with one of the major mining organisations here in Australia, and their plans were 15 to 30 years out. So, because it takes a much longer process to change an established program or an established organization, and just simply the scale of the size of the organization dictates that they need longer to think about these things. So I think it really depends, and also I guess the other factor is depending on what plans you have to grow. So if you're thinking that we are going to double the size of our organization in the next 5 years, 5 years would seem to be a pretty good starting point. But I would actually say come back in a little from that and actually start to build your plan for a 2 to 3 year horizon, and then iterate as you go. And I think the key thing is just to get started and understand the workforce that you have. Then you can start to think about the plans that you need to make. And there's nothing wrong with pushing your plan out, bringing it closer in if that's what's required. In fact, I always suggest to people that they once they've built a plan and they've got it in place, that they review it every 6 to 12 months to make sure it's still relevant for what they're doing.
And do you look at milestones along that plan? So say you decide, look, we want to have 2 years worth of planning in the bank. We want to know the direction, and as you said, reviewing that every quarter, every 6 months to make sure that it's still accurate. But do I'd imagine in that plan it's about breaking up. Well, like for the next 2 years, here are our business milestones. We're going to expand into a new region in 2 years' time, but here are the things we need to do to lead up to that. It might be upskilling and building up say you're a tech business and you're trying to build up your support network to be able to cover going into a new region, or build up a partnership program, so you can go in soft into a new market with an existing network of people to engage. So it's I'm coming at this from quite a rudimentary knowledge of how it works, but I'd imagine it's about looking at all of the scenarios and all of the milestones across that sort of period. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. I think the key thing there is scenario. And I think what you should be thinking about is we expect this to happen. So we are going to plan for these scenarios. So if you take the example of moving into a new market, you might say, okay, we're going to expand into this area or into this market or into this product. And this is what we anticipate happening. And these are the things that we expect. And those aspects could be your milestones. So it could be, the initial piece is to actually buy an office in an area and then make sure that office has all the right infrastructure, and then the office then can start to recruit people to maybe work from that as a hub, for example. And so the various milestones really call themselves out. Now, the things that will change those milestones and make the appraisal of the plan more important are things that are outside your control. So things that happen. So you might be full steam ahead going towards a market, and then all of a sudden something hits you blindside. So it could be a new competitor comes on the market and starts really diluting where you were intending to be. It could be we have an epidemic, for example. There's a whole range of things that could happen that you then go, aha, now I need to review my plan because I didn't know this was going to happen, but it looks like it's more likely to happen. So let's think about what are the implications of that. There's so many factors that we just can't, the weather events, there's so many different things that are happening around the world right now, particularly with supply chain and other aspects that affect business, that we need to keep an eye on things and make sure that we adapt. And that means, making sure that the plan reflects what's actually going on.
So you mentioned technology earlier, and as I said, I've not done workforce planning before. I've done a little bit of M&A integration of businesses, and the starting point for us for the first one we went through was Excel spreadsheets. Like we kept it very simple, and then evolved it over time as we were doing it more and more often. Where do I start tech wise with workforce planning? Is it as simple as using a Google Sheet or Excel to start mapping out a bit of a Gantt chart, a bit of a strategy?
I think absolutely. You don't need to really heavily invest in tech right from day one. And in fact, a lot of the tech vendors would counsel against going in until you're ready to use their software or their product, because they're not gonna benefit if you buy a product 6 months or 12 months too early and then don't use it, because you're not getting any value from it. So I think start small. But again, starting small, think about what do we need to actually do. So to do a basic supply and demand analysis or a scenario plan, absolutely, you can use Google Sheets or you can use Microsoft Excel. Those are fine. Those tools have been around a long time. And of course, the benefits of using those tools is that most people in your organization know how to use them. So there's no training. You can actually get stuck in pretty quickly. And most people, when they look at a spreadsheet, they understand what it means, right? And they understand what it's telling them. So that's a really, really great way to get going. And then I think what happens is you then get to a place where you're starting to scale. And what does scaling mean? Scaling means more and more eyes looking at what you're doing. And so you need more and more people to contribute and to actually be able to be informed. And you need to keep them informed. And obviously you need a little bit more structure to your planning. And that's when you can get into more specific tools. My friends over at Equate have a tool for strategic workforce planning, and they help with scenario planning, and they bring in the data together and so on. So that's specifically for strategic workforce planning. You've other tools like Anaplan, Visio is another one, where they are more planning tools. So, Anaplan particularly is more in the finance space, but or the CRM space, but they actually can then be adapted to use for strategic workforce planning. And of course, most organizations, any large organizations, have got some kind of human capital management tool. So, the Workdays, SAPs, all the other guys, there's a lot of new, smaller players coming through now, and a lot of them realize that planning is a bit large part of HR's remit now, and so they are building these modules into their tech. And so an obvious case would be, if you've already got that tool, to see how you can embrace the options that they give you, so that you can have it all in one place. And there is a lot to be said of having all of your analysis and so on in a single place, so that you can share it more easily. But I do think you're right. You've got to start small. You don't need to invest. If you're going to invest anywhere, invest in data first, and so that you can actually make some really good planning decisions. And then really the tech will follow, because you'll be then using the right tools to make sure that you're sharing that information and those decisions that you're making in the most effective and efficient way.
And I'd imagine the shift to bigger tech, more robust tech, is also linked to the need for the data itself, in it being accessible, the amount of information that you're trying to bring in and review. If it's a smaller business, or you're starting, as you said earlier, maybe starting on a particular business unit rather than looking at the entire workforce. Let's focus on sales, because we know we've got an increased need there, or demand coming in the next little while. That's fine. It might be 20 people. You've got the data points. It's okay to manage. But when you start to look at maybe 100 people, or 300, or 1,000, the number of data points, even if you've got 5 or 6, as you mentioned, as the sort of entry level ones, multiply that by 1,000. That's a lot of information that you're bringing in from multiple sources. So the integrations with those technologies really help support the management of that data in a secure and safe way, which I think is probably another key driver.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head there. I think just remember, we're talking about people data here. So it's quite sensitive, and it's quite, it needs to be in a secure environment. So I think that having the right tech at the right time is really important. The more eyeballs that are looking at this information, because as you scale, more and more people are helping you do this planning work, and companies scale in different ways. Some scale through their business functions and are able to share information with them. Others do it through their business partnering, HR business partnering frameworks. But even it doesn't matter which way you do it, more and more people are getting involved, and so you really do need to have a method to maintain the privacy of the data that you've got. Not only because it's really important to make sure it's secure, but also, you've got quite a lot of competitive advantage in the information and the data that you have captured and have put together, and so you want to make sure that it's restricted, and only the people who need to see it can see it. But then, in the same way, you can share things in an aggregated form with the people who need to see it, so they can do the planning that they need to do. So I think, the more you scale, the more people that are involved in the process, the better your technology, or your approach to technology needs to be, and you need to be more structured and organised.
So before we wrap up, just I guess while we're looking into the future and for our organisations, one of the big talking points I'm hearing with a lot of clients is around the impacts of AI to our organisations' planning, the people that we've got, the roles that we have now. There's alarmist articles coming out every week saying that, here's a list of jobs that won't exist in 10 years' time because AI is going to make them redundant. How focusing? I was going to ask you more broadly on trends, but just on AI specifically, how do you think that's impacting the way that businesses are going about workforce planning? Considering the impacts of not only roles being entirely replaced, but roles evolving and changing the capacity, the capability that they have, what they can do now, and what they'll be able to do in the future.
No, it's a fascinating time to be doing this work, because I think AI has been around for quite some time. It's been in the public front of mind for the public for probably the last 12 months or so, but organizations like Fathom have been using AI for 5 or 6 years, to enable us to understand work and how technology will impact work. And I think the one thing that we've realized is that the robots won't take our jobs. The robots will come and take the parts of the jobs that we find the most boring or the most repetitive or the things that we don't need to use a lot of brain power for. All right. So they're or the, you know, quantum computing aside, you bring a piece of tech or machinery or an AI or piece of AI technology to replace tasks that are repetitive that could be done, more efficiently by a machine. And so that what that does, it gives us as humans a really fascinating opportunity to start to broaden our skills and broaden our use of our knowledge and the things that a computer cannot do. And I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast has used an AI GPT model of some sort, and I've noticed it's great if you're writing an article or you're writing a presentation. You can tap what you need into the machine, and it comes out with a great load of really good content that you think fantastic. But then when you actually start to read it, you realize you need to apply your knowledge, the special knowledge and special skills that you might have, to actually make it meaningful and make it more valuable to the reader. And I think that is a really good analogy for workforce planning, because whilst the machines can come in and be implemented to do more repetitive tasks, whether it's chatbots answering the telephone or whether it's actually just robotics just conducting a process, that you'll still need that human element, but it will be of a higher order. So you're actually understanding what the machine is doing and being able to make sure it's doing it correctly, being able to put in tests and challenges to make sure that it can be more effective. And of course, you're going to need to keep training this machine as you learn more so that they continue to get more effective. So I think the opportunity for us is to think more about how the machines can help us and take away that boring stuff so we can do really more higher order work. And of course, if you're doing higher order work, the potential is that you could earn more. I think the other thing to think about as well is that there's a lot of the data companies that I mentioned earlier, Fathom, Beamery, Drought, Lightcast, and so on. They have been using AI for a number of years now. And it's getting very, very clever. So when they're scraping job ads and understanding what skills are in the markets, so if you want to know what the top 5 skills are for a data scientist, you can actually get that quite accurately, because what they're not only just going through a document and scraping it out, they're actually putting it into context. So they're looking at what are the contexts around a specific skill set so that they can make sure it's relevant. In the early days, I remember an incident where I was working at Transport for New South Wales, and we had arterial road engineers. And when we looked at some of the outputs we were getting at the time, it considered those to be cardiovascular surgeons because it had the word arterial in the job description. Well, of course, in an arterial road, it's completely different context. Well, now that context is far more clear. Yeah. And that's just a very small example, but that's what I mean by the contextual approach of some of these models. So I think that the data is getting far more accurate so that we can integrate that into our planning. And I think we're getting more mature in how we understand the benefits of what AI can give us, and I think people are sort of understanding that better, so that they grasp that this is an opportunity to grow themselves and grow their careers.
Fantastic. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Dave, and I've certainly learned a lot. So really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, JP. Always a pleasure.
Take care.
Today's episode has been brought to you by Strictly Workforce Planning. Strictly Workforce Planning helps organisations develop and implement effective workforce planning programs aligned to specific business strategies. They provide a comprehensive approach to identifying and addressing workforce gaps, ensuring the right talent is in place to achieve your business objectives. The team will guide you through each step to build out a bespoke strategic workforce planning program that will enable your organisation to take the most appropriate course of action to ensure that you have the workforce that you need. Where they differ from other providers is via ongoing support, committing to stay with their clients as long as they need until they're confident to run the program on their own. They can also offer flexibility via mentoring, supporting clients to include everyone in the future that they are building. A big thank you to Strictly Workforce Planning for their support.